question of who is God to me is an interesting question because I don't think I've ever asked it. I've asked a lot of questions about God. I've asked questions about, God, why do you allow certain things to happen? That's probably been one of the bigger theological questions that I've had in my life. And I've also been concerned about the question, which is related, is where is God? And so when it comes to God questions, the question of why and where have been much more significant in my thinking, in my spiritual life, than the questions of who and what. So I'm sure that there are people who the who and what questions are very important to them. And I always honor people's questions, but I can't help you with those because those haven't been my questions. I can encourage you, if you're struggling with those questions, maybe the answer is to shift your questions. Because sometimes we come to a puzzle or a place in our own path where we're asking the wrong W question. So it's, for me, the questions of where God is and why God seems either absent or to allow certain kinds of things are the questions that have been more deeply troubling to me in my journey. The way that those questions right now I answer is the where question. If we respond by saying that God is in heaven, we actually have attached to that answer a certain vision of who God is and what God is like. Yeah, so if we say if God is in heaven, we say that's the answer to the where question. God becomes essentially an old man on a throne sitting in the clouds, who is white, who is male, who is who is far away from us, and who exists looking down on the world. And all of those things about who God is have created huge problems in human culture, particularly in Western society, where we think God, because we're reflecting somehow God's image in us, where we think what's best, what's closest to God is anything that's male, white, sort of distant and removed, separated from us, and who is above everything else. And so that kind of vision of where God is gives us a picture of who God is. And from that, we get a structure of what the world is like. And that vision of God fuels the pyramid-shaped universe, where there's the best, wisest, richest people on top, and they're closest to God, and what they do is divinely ordained, and then beneath them is everybody else. And so in that construct of where God is, we open ourselves to the idea that, for example, poor people who are at the bottom of a social pyramid, well, they're far away from God because they're at the bottom of the pyramid. And rich people, they must be holier, or they have better spiritual lives. God loves them because they've been blessed with wealth and they're at the top of the pyramid. So when we talk about where God is, we're talking about who God is.
Sounds like a jerk.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, and God sounds like a jerk and really a very unfair boss, as it were. And maybe even Caesar or some other kind of imperial ruler. And that whole idea, the answer to the question of where is God, has gotten us into that incredible muddle in our social, economic, and political constructs of wealth and privilege. So that's why the question of where is God to me is so important. It really winds up being a question of the nature, who is God. The profound realization that God is with us here moves God from the clouds to this horizon. So God is with us as we are muddling along in life, as we are experiencing suffering and joy, God is with us. And so the idea of a truly present God is one of the most radical things that we can experience. In the scriptures, of course, the Christian story, the idea of God being with us, that's one of the names of Jesus. And so when Jesus is born, the hope for Jesus is his name shall be Emmanuel, God with us, which was an ancient hope of the Jewish people. And then Jesus is born into the world. Christians have an entire theology of this. It's called the theology of the incarnation. And the incarnation is the idea that the divine presence, that God's own being comes and dwells among us. And for many years, I've been fascinated by the idea that Christians act as if the cross kills the incarnation, and that when Jesus raises from the dead, Jesus goes into heaven, and that somehow that takes away or it diminishes the power of the incarnation, that it cancels out the birth. And I don't think that that's the way it should work. The incarnation is a continuing reality of the person of Jesus. It is a continuing reality of what Christianity teaches to be one of the major acts of God toward God's creation. So just because Jesus became a human person and then Jesus dies, and then the teaching, of course, of Jesus being raised again, it does not cancel out that Jesus is here. And then the point is sort of reinforced that the incarnation doesn't go away when shortly after the story of the resurrection and Jesus' ascension, we get this other thing that happens, and that is the Holy Spirit comes and animates the reality of the incarnation. Right. And now it's not just that God is incarnate in Jesus, but that God, through Jesus, becomes incarnate to the whole world by the power of the Spirit. And so to embrace the radicalness of the theology of God with us, to answer the question that God is here, now, with, in, and through the world, is probably one of the greatest possible renewing, empowering things we can believe to be true. So the question of where is the question. It's not the question of who. How you answer the question of where leads you to who you think God is. Is God in heaven as an old man sitting on a distant throne waiting to judge you or waiting to welcome you into some sort of eternal castle in the sky? Or is God the pulsating, ever-creating presence of love and compassion that animates every second of all of creation? As many extraordinary theologians have said through history, from people who are seen to be more liberal like Paul Tillich to Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards had that as his essential vision.
News, that's not true.
Jonathan Edwards' essential vision was an ever-creating God who held all of the universe together by animating its actions in every single second of the day. That was Edwards' primary answer to the question, where is God? To St. Francis, back through the mystics, to the early church fathers like Gregory of Nyssa. And so when it comes of lines of tradition, I am more than happy to stand in a line that says the question, where is God, is the most important question. And the answer is phenomenally crystal clear. God is here with us. I have actually loved writing these last two books because the whole point of the book called Grounded was the idea that God was with us here in the world. And I take readers on really a journey into the world of my own life and point out how God is present in the world with us, the world of neighbors and the world of nature. Then in Grateful, I was thinking about, okay, so God is here. So what? How do we live? And through this very quirky set of circumstances, I began to feel this pull and this inclination to writing a book about gratitude. And somehow I knew that gratitude was connected to living a grounded life, to living a life of God with us. And as the project unfolded, it really became so, the connection between the two became so powerful to me, because if God is here with us, God is constituting all of the time the table, that God is sitting with us at this table in this wilderness at this time, and that God's always offering to that table gifts. And so the two pieces of the story really became, where is God in Grounded? And now the next question is, why? Why is the world this way? And the answer is in Grateful. The world is this way because we have not practiced the reality of that grace and those gifts. The reason why the world is this way is we have turned a table of abundance into a table of scarcity. And if we can recover the deepest why? Because we live in God's table, we live at God's table, because gifts are freely given, because grace animates everything. And why is because we have hoarded the gifts. And think of how the world would be transformed.
That sounds gospel-y.
Oh my gosh. It's a friend of mine said, that sounds like the good news. And I said, no, it's not just the good news, it's the best news. It is the greatest news ever. Because if we don't hoard those things, instead we just respond in love, we pass around the gifts of abundance. So many of the things that we see as the problem of evil would go away. Poverty, people who are trapped in cycles of disease and abuse. Not everyone goes away because, of course, fear goes away. Yeah, violence goes away. We don't, not everything becomes perfect, but things become a lot better if we understand that we live in a circle of abundance, at a table of gifts, and that our job is to keep inviting people to the table, keep feeding people, and know that there's always enough. There's always enough.
And what gives you the hope that those tables will be reborn and emerge?
The thing that gives me hope right now is that there's so much that's bad, and so many people are sad and afraid, that there might be the possibility to hear and understand the table that we haven't had for a very long time. Because as long as we were living within a pyramid that rewarded certain people, it was worthwhile keeping the pyramid in place, because we thought, oh yeah, it's going to be okay. The pyramid worked for me, so it's going to work for other people too. It just takes time. But now I think that we are feeling, in so many ways around the planet, the failure of that pyramid structure. There's really an emotional battle going on around the whole of the globe between the people who are saying, no, really, it is the pyramid. And the point is we have to build the pyramid stronger with bigger walls and thicker base. And that's going to be the answer to all of our problems. But there are so many more people who are seeing that is a lie. and that we really need to be living in an alternative story, and that there really is the only other story of beauty that is available to us is this story about gifts and grace and tables and circles and living with one another. It's the story that Martin Luther King was preaching before he died. I love he has this great speech. He talks about the world house. And people forget that speech and that vision of King. They always think of King, oh, he's a Christian minister, and he was a Christian minister.
His name was King too.
It is kind of funny his name was King, but they say, oh, he's a Christian minister, so he's talking about the church and he's talking about Christian society. But in the last couple years of his life, he was saying things like, we now live in a great world house where there are Christians and Muslims and Hindus and Jews and people who don't believe in God. And we are all going to have to learn to live together, or we are all...
New table liturgy.
Yeah, or we are all going to die together. We are all going to have to sit at this table of the world together, or we are all going to die together. And that's the urgency of now. There was the urgency of now when it came to civil rights and the immediate problems of freeing Black people from the shackles of injustice that had bound them here in the United States. But there was this bigger right, this human right that King was opening up, and that was the right to sit at the table together. And he knew that the table was salvation, and that all of us together, no one owning abundance, nobody controlling the gifts, that table, that would be our salvation. And if we didn't set it, we were going to die. And so that's where we are, is that he was right. And a lot of people know that now. And my sister is a mathematician. And we're not much alike at all. She's also an atheist. And we were talking about this, about pyramids and about tables. And she heard me preach on the power of the table. And she came up to me afterwards. We're driving back to her house. And she said, you know where a pyramid gets its power? And I said, from the bottom? And she laughed, because of course if the pyramid gets its power from the bottom, why have we ever had slavery? The bottom is always inherently unstable in some ways of a pyramid. And she said, no, a pyramid only survives because of the middle. And so when you draw a circle within a pyramid, if the circle in the middle of a pyramid is stable, the pyramid survives. She said, but if the circle begins to fray, if there's discontent, if the circle is not balanced enough, if the circle begins to experience some sort of discontent, if the circle falls within the pyramid, then the pyramid can't be stable. And I just looked at that and I thought to myself, well, I guess it pays to know something about geometry.
Right.
Is that right now, the circle which has been held in slavery by the pyramid is inherently destabilizing. And if that circle can move out into the world as an independent geometry of politics and a geometry of spirituality and a geometry of theology and a geometry of economics, then we might have a new world at hand. Is that we are seeking a new structure, and the collapse of the pyramid opens the way for a circle. I think one of the most interesting things that has happened in recent weeks, as I've been talking about gratitude to different groups of people, is I presented these these alternatives: the structure of scarcity, the idea of debt and duty, and then the biblical idea, which is that of a table that is set by God in the wilderness, and it's a table of abundance. The food never ends; it never stops. The gifts never. They just never cease. And so many stories in both the Old Testament and the New Testament are about just that. The manna in the wilderness, God offering provision for the prophets when they are wandering the desert, caring for the people even when they're in exile. Lament and gratitude come together in the Psalms in a beautiful and amazing way. And then, of course, Jesus' stories of the feeding of the 4,000, the feeding of the 5,000. That's not about a miracle, about Jesus sort of snapping his fingers and having a bunch of fish show up. That is about, it's a story that illustrates that Jesus is a channel of God's fullest abundance. That even when you think there's not enough food, that you have 5,000 people to feed and you only have a few fishes and a loaf of bread, that nevertheless, there still really, truly are gifts. And that scarcity is not the reality of the universe, but rather in God's presence, abundance is always the reality. So I've been talking about that and preaching sermons on it. And actually, it's really changed the way that I understand my life and that I understand gratitude. Because I used to think that gratitude was simply a feeling. If somebody gave me something nice, well, I felt good about that because we all like getting gifts. But the truth of the matter is we are all given gifts all the time. Every single day that we are alive, there is a gift because we're alive. There's breath, there's water to drink, there's friendship to be had. We are conscious, we're in this beautiful, amazing world. We're surrounded by gifts. And even if you have the worst day possible, you have a gift because you're alive. And so that is it's a reality. We live in giftedness. And that does make us go, oh, that's amazing. And we feel something. But then those feelings call us into an ethic. They call us into action, into a way of life, into doing something. And so the next step is not just, I feel fantastic that I'm alive even on this really horrible day, and that I'm not dead and that I can breathe and that with any hope there'll be a day tomorrow. And so we have the feeling, but now the question is, well, what do I do about that?
So gratitude, it's not a feeling, it's in relationship to something.
Right. It's always in relationship to something because we never feel grateful unless there's been a gift. And there's never a gift without a giver. And so
You can take a gift.
well, actually, I talk about the idea of receiving communion, how we misunderstand communion when we talk about we take the bread and wine, but that the word is translated as receive, labete, which we translate as take in many churches, is actually it means to receive this gift. And so that whole idea that we are receivers is one of the most important things to understand about all of us as human beings, is that before we're anything else, we receive.
How so?
Well, if you were born, you've received a gift. It had absolutely nothing to do with you. You were gifted with that life. If you believe in God, if you're a theist, God has given you that life. If you are an atheist or a humanist, you believe that your parents' DNA has combined to give you that life. Some scientific process has given you that life.
It's a gift of just the whole miracle of creation and stars and molecules just to get to this point where I could be born.
That's right. The universe has gifted you with life. And so whether a theist or a mystical scientist or a humanist, the first thing that happens to any of us as human beings is something that none of us either take or control. And then, of course, because the way the human beings are, the way that we're made, through the first years of our lives, that's primarily all gift as well. Because someone has to feed us, tend us, clean us, protect us, keep us from being ill, caring for us when we're sick. And if someone doesn't do that for you, you have nothing. And certainly people talk about sometimes that how their babies are the greatest gift they've ever received, and that's fair enough. We can talk about how children give us gifts even though they never really even intended. But the truth of the matter is that really our lives for the first decade or so can completely be seen as a series of gifts that are given to us by other people who honestly are under no obligation to care for us or really give us gifts. And so it's an amazing thing being a human in that way. So it just amazes me that American culture in particular has diminished that idea so greatly, so that we think, we're born and then we grow into these independent spirits and that we take what we need.
I mean, how do you win if you're receiving? You can't win through receiving.
And that's, of course, what no religious tradition teaches. No religious tradition teaches that winning is the
Christian country, I think we've been taught.
no religious tradition teaches us that winning is the point. Loving, is the point. And so we live in this universe where our lives are bathed in gifts from the very beginning. And we are, first of all, receivers. And when I was a little girl, of course, my mom always taught me it's better to give than to receive. But you can't give anything until you've received. And so that is really one of the false myths of American culture, is that there is such a thing as a pure benefactor, that there's someone who is a magic savior who's going to give us all the gifts that we deserve. And if we're just good enough, or if we will be loyal enough, or we work hard enough, the person with those gifts is going to pay attention to us, and they'll reward us. And then we will say thank you in return, and maybe do that person a favor because they have been our benefactor. And all of that is just basically ancient Rome brought up to contemporary America. And that's the very thing that Jesus was arguing against in the whole of the New Testament.
And where did it get him?
Well, it got him the fact that he's loved and revered and remembered as one of the most compassionate humans that ever lived. And pretty much everybody remembers Jesus' name, but there are very few people who even were Caesar, whose name people remember. If you are fairly literate, if you know something about science or literature, you might know Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar, or maybe Nero. But beyond that, I don't see too many people worshiping any of those people or remembering them fondly. But the truth of the matter is that Jesus, who set a table of gifts, that's what the Thursday and Holy Week is all about, is Jesus is reminding his friends of God's abundance, of the freedom, the exodus that comes from abundance.
Say that again. Exodus comes from abundance?
Yeah. Well, at that table, those gifts, the Exodus, they're celebrating Passover. And Passover is truly a celebration of God's abundant gifts for everybody, where the people, the ancient Israelites, leave slavery, where Pharaoh has controlled every movement of their lives, all the food they've gotten, all the provision they have, who they could marry, whether or not they could keep their children. And so Pharaoh created for the slaves a universe of scarcity. And with the Passover, when they leave slavery and go to what becomes the Holy Land, God promises them that they'll be in a land of milk and honey, and that they have passed over from scarcity to abundance. And the idea that we have that God sets a table in the wilderness comes from that sojourn, that trip from a scarcity to abundance, when the people in Israel were so afraid, well, who's going to take care of us now? We're going to be starving to death. We're out
I need
here.
some good fish.
Yeah, we need something to eat. And they didn't trust that it really was a universe of abundance. And some of them started saying, oh, let's go back. At least Pharaoh fed us. Even though Pharaoh might have taken our children and murdered them, nevertheless, we had food. And that's where the Israelites, the line actually comes from. Can God set us a table in this wilderness? And God says, damn right I can. And manna falls, and water comes from the rock. And there all of a sudden is abundance. That's the story that is being replayed on Thursday night of Holy Week before Jesus dies. It's a story about people passing over.
Nobody told me that story before.
Right.
It's a good one.
It is a good one.
I started going Thursdays.
I love Thursday night of Holy Week. It's my favorite night of that.
Good news.
Of that week. It's great news. You pass over from slavery into the freedom of a fully gifted world. And so that's what's happening around that table on Thursday night, is Jesus is saying, this is the truth. This is the Passover that you have been waiting for. Just in the same way God took your ancestors out of slavery with Pharaoh, so I'm taking you out of slavery to Caesar, and the new age, the age of freedom, the Exodus, the liberation has now opened. And so that moment, I think for the disciples, must have been so critical in their understanding of who Jesus was and who they were going to become. I think that is really the transformative night of Holy Week. So often we get hung up what happens on Good Friday on the cross. But I think that for the disciples, the real insight, the depth and power of what was going on happened the night before. It happened on Thursday.
Friendship.
Yeah, it's about friendship and not living in hierarchy. It's about being around a table and not being stuck at the bottom of a pyramid. It's about not being a slave, but being a servant. If you really understand the contrast between what was happening, if you understand the framework, first of all, of the Exodus, and then the idea that Caesar is functionally the new Pharaoh, and then you contrast everything that is happening in their political world, where these people are at the bottom of this social construct, and their lives are really held at the whim of the Roman Empire. Caesar could stop feeding all of Israel any day that Caesar wanted to. These people who had given up their day jobs to follow Jesus, and we sometimes think of that as, oh my gosh, how hard that would have been to give up, your livelihood as a fisherman and just go follow Jesus. In truth be told, it was not that hard at all, because those fishermen paid 90% of whatever they made in fishing to Caesar as their gratitude for being part of the Roman Empire. And so when Jesus called them and said, hey, stop fishing, it was like Jesus was literally calling them out of the utmost poverty and a life of control, where they were being forced to tithe 90% of everything they made back to the very person who was holding them in slavery by this corrupted system of gratitude. And so I don't know about you, but as soon as Jesus walked by and said, follow me, I'd be on that trip. Right. It's like, yeah, get me out of here. There's got to be something better. And so they journey with Jesus. They listen to his stories. They see things like the feeding of the 4,000, the feeding of the 5,000. They see that their rabbi, Jesus, is also a person who lives Jesus lives in the reality of God's abundance.
You don't think they were like, wow, thanks to do this, we could get a lot of stuff too?
Sure.
We could get mansions too.
Yeah, I think that probably the disciples did at first. Yeah, they did not understand at first that they were following Jesus that would turn into a way of life that was so radical. I think when Jesus called them away from slavery and said, I'm going to do something different for you, they probably thought they were going to become the, sort of the top dogs in the Roman Empire, that the whole thing would be turned over and that they would get to be the overlords, and that meant they would become wealthy and that other people would be held in slavery underneath of them. But as it all turns out, if they were paying attention for the 3 years, Jesus was offering something entirely different. He was saying, no, we're not going to set up a new system of hierarchy with somebody on top and somebody else on the bottom. He says, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. And so, so he's, so when he says that thing about last and first, he's not saying, oh, I'm going to set up a new pyramid. He's just taking the whole thing down. He's opening their imagination to the possibility of a world where there really is no first or last. And so Jesus is constantly doing this, enlarging their imagination until that Thursday night, when it all becomes perfectly clear, where it becomes about washing one another's feet, about not who is sitting at the head of the table, but being a family around a table. It's about how bread and wine are going to sustain us on this journey of compassion, of love, of grace, of salvation. And that the line that we get that comes down to liturgical Christians in the celebration of the Lord's Supper or the Lord's Prayer, or excuse me, of the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, that line, the gifts of God for the people of God. Receive this and do it in remembrance of me. And what he was saying when he did that, and what we say when we're reenacting that, is the gifts are that whole table of abundance. It's for everybody.
I matter. I don't need a mansion.
Yeah, who needs a mansion at that point? Who needs a prosperity gospel? You're sitting at a table with your friends, and you're going to be fed. And that table, throughout time, the vision is there are going to be more and more and more and more chairs pulled up to that table. And so that Thursday night is the last supper of a world of oppression and violence and control and the kind of gratitude that taxes you 90% in order to keep you in slavery. So it's the last supper of all of that. But it's also the first feast. And it's the first feast of the world that God has always dreamed of. And Good Friday becomes such a devastation for these people, not only because, of course, they are watching the murderous, violent execution of their friend, which is horrible enough, but in fact, what Rome is doing by destroying Jesus' body is destroying the table. And so Rome does not want a table of abundance where all people are fed.
Why are they afraid? They think relationship is more powerful than leverage?
Yes, they can't imagine the structure of ancient Rome running now on debt. I owe you a debt of gratitude. I'm obligated to you until I discharge that debt. And it's running on, of course, corrupted forms of that, quid pro quo, tit for tat. I do this so that you must do that. It's not running on the idea of noblesse oblige and really nice benefactors, but it's running on the idea that benefactors use gifts to maintain status and power and increase their own wealth. That's the kind of gratitude that runs the Roman Empire. And of course, the people who are at the top of that system, they don't want some crazy table set in the wilderness where everybody gets fed, and where those people are so empowered that they then begin to share gifts that they don't even really seem to have, like, hey, we've only got a little bit of bread and a couple fishes here. But as soon as those people really begin to experience abundance, that's going to turn into a lot. And that feast, that vision of the feast turns into a powerful political vision of a different kind of society. And that's what Jesus was doing on Holy Thursday. It was reminding us of what God really intended. And so Good Friday then takes that away. It destroys it. It devastates it. It's like, it's not just Jesus' body, as I said, dying on the cross. It's not just Jesus' body dying on the cross. It's literally Rome coming in and taking axes to that table and making sure that that table is never set. Because if that table is set, they know they're doomed. And so that's what Good Friday is. The destruction of a body and the destruction of a table. The destruction of a feast. And that's why Easter Sunday becomes so extraordinary. Is because God finally says enough. You're not going to do it. You're not getting away with it this time. There have been too many acts of violence that destroyed my table. There have been too many insane politicians who wanted to take the feast away from the people of the world. I'm not going to let it happen this time. No more Pharaoh, no more Caesar. Instead, I'm going to reset this table. And so when Jesus rises and then starts this series at the end of all of the Gospels of these appearances, where he shows up again with his friends, almost every one of those appearances happens around a table. Jesus is recognized by his friends after they've been walking down a road to Emmaus. They've been having a great talk. They sit at a table, and when he breaks bread, they say, "Oh, it's Jesus." Jesus shows up at a table where the disciples have gone to the same room where they held the Last Supper, and he breathes a grace on them. He actually gifts them with a gratitude blessing at that table. Peace. It's a prayer. Peace. And all of a sudden the world turns upside down for them. Jesus feeds the disciples on a beach, fish. You look at those accounts, depending on how you count, there's somewhere between 10 and 15 of them. And the vast majority of them happen around a meal. And if that doesn't make the point, Jesus does not come back and say, he doesn't come back and go to Calvary and say, hey, look at the cross. Look at that violent instrument of death that Caesar tried to use to stop all this.
I don't have anything to do with that.
Yeah, Jesus does not point to the cross. Jesus points to the table.
I don't have anything to do with death. I'm about the table.
That's right. Yeah, the instruments of death, the instruments of empire, cross, gone. That's what the point of Easter is. We should not wear crosses around our neck. We should be wearing circles that represent tables, because that's the point.